All right. Hey, what's up, everyone? It's Paul here with CloseSimple. Thanks so much for joining our webinar today. I'm excited to have Jeff Bray with me today. We're going to get into our webinar NAR topic in just a second, but we like to start on time, end in time. We're going to go through about 20 minutes of content today. And as we go through this, if you have any questions, just put your questions right into Zoom here, and then we're going to stay on for a while and answer as many of those as we can. But before we dive in, Jeff, we're not attorneys. You're a broker. I work in title. And so we're going to do our best to go through this, but please, as we go through this, just understand from a caveat perspective that this isn't necessarily legal guidance. This is just a conversation about what's actually going on here, and we're going to get into it. Okay, before we get into our webinar today, we're going to be just talking real briefly about CloseSimple. So CloseSimple, we love working with tech-driven title and escrow companies who care about the customer experience. We do a lot of this through our communication strategies, our portal, fraud prevention. There's a lot of different ways that we partner with title companies to really enhance the customer experience. And we really like to say it's one software to simplify and secure the closing. So as we're getting into this now, let's start talking about the webinars. We do webinars on a regular basis here at CloseSimple. If you go to closesimple.com/webinars, you can go and check out all of those. Make sure you take some time to kind of review. We've got topics like the one we're talking about today, along with conversations with folks from the industry. So let's get into this. Jeff, we're looking at what's on screen right now. I'm pretty sure this is going to turn and make sense when people actually see the recording of this, but let's talk about our webinar today. Let's get into it. So before we do, Jeff, why don't you introduce yourself? You're with us today. You've spent a lot of time in the real estate space, but give us a little bit of your background and why you're here to talk with us.
Yeah, absolutely. First off, thanks for having me. Big fan of you guys here at CloseSimple, and it's a pleasure to be in your headquarters today. It's pretty awesome place to spend Wednesday. Is it Wednesday? Yeah. Pretty awesome place to spend a Wednesday. Yes, as Paul said, my name's Jeff. I'm a broker and an owner of a real estate firm here in the Twin Cities Metro, Minneapolis, St. Paul. Engel & Volkers is the name of our firm, and it is a national franchise. So if you're in other parts of the country, you may know of Engel & Volkers advisors or brokers or locations that they have. So we like to talk a little bit about that presence all over the globe, really, not just in the United States. My journey into where I'm at now as a managing broker and an owner of a company is I guess you could say it's typical. I started out as a real estate agent working under a pretty large franchise umbrella for a number of years. Then I went on to that team phase where I had a team within this real estate company. And then ultimately, the desire to become an owner or a broker, if you will, of a company was really a passion project. We're very protective of our industry. It's constantly under attack. Right now, being one of those pretty national newsline, national headline attention-grabbing threats to our industry. And we very much value the clients that we get to serve, and we really want to put them at the forefront. And as part of that, it's educating not only our advisors at Engel & Volkers and others even inside the industry that aren't with our company, but the title industry, the mortgage brokers that are out there, the clients. It's a team. It's a team effort to get somebody from where they're at to wanting to transact in real estate, whether it's to sell a house or to buy a house or it's commercial, you name it. They have a goal in mind, and it all comes, the whole team has to be on board and know exactly what's happening. So I'm excited to be here today to talk about these massive, monumental, whatever big word we can use, because I think that there's an aspect of this where it could be overplayed, because we don't know how it's all going to unfold. But I can tell you 5 days in, it is quite a monumental change to the way the industry is conducting business on the residential real estate side. Commercial, not really affected by this a whole lot. But on the residential real estate side of things, this is a huge change for the entire nation. The whole United States went through a massive change last week. So timing is important.
Yeah, it's important. And I'm sure as those of you who are on the webinar today, a lot of title company owners, operators, real estate attorneys, and we're really going to try to get to some nuts and bolts here as we get into kind of like how we got here, as well as what are the impacts for your customers, for the real estate agents that you're working with, as well as for yourselves, for title, what it's going to look like from a real estate attorney perspective, from a title perspective. And obviously, Jeff, Real estate's been evolving. We've been friends for a long time. We've talked about this. Obviously, in the last few years, we've seen a lot happening, either from different types of real estate brokerages coming around. We've got tech companies who are now real estate companies. We've seen a lot, but I don't think we've ever seen anything quite like this before. And Jeff and I were actually talking recently, and you're like, I've been going through all this stuff in terms of how I'm getting my brokerage ready to handle these big changes. And so we're going to talk about that now. We're going to get into this. So Jeff, what ultimately drove this lawsuit? How did we find ourselves here today in August of 2024?
Over the course of the last number of years, there have been lawsuits that have been proposed by various plaintiffs arguing the case that real estate commissions and the way things are done in residential real estate aren't necessarily fair. It's a litigious country we live in, and lawsuits they're not something that's unusual. There's thousands and thousands happening every single day. And many of these lawsuits regarding how real estate commissions have been paid have gotten some legs over the course of time, but never really got far enough to where it was going to affect how business was done. That changed over the course of the last 18, 24 months, in which a major lawsuit actually did get a lot of legs, and it went to a very high level court. And the main premise behind it was there's a lot of talk around the Sherman Antitrust Act was invoked in a lot of the discussions in the case, saying that there's not a lot of transparency in the way commissions are done, calculated, communicated from realtor to realtor, brokerage to brokerage. And it ultimately went to trial. It didn't take long. This was in November, and it was held in Kansas, in a Supreme Court in Kansas, very high level court. And ultimately, in layman's terms, what was decided by the judge and ultimately the plaintiffs won against the defendants, which was NAR, the National Association of Realtors. Various real estate franchises and big companies were a part of the defendants as well. And in layman's terms, it was, I, a consumer, if I don't play your game, if I don't play your commission game, meaning if I don't put my house on the multiple listing service and I don't offer a commission to a buyer's representative, my house is not going to be marketed properly. My house will not have as high of a chance of selling as someone else who plays that game. Now, this is my industry, right? This is my passion. I don't believe that we play games. The plaintiffs and the judge felt otherwise, and that's one of the best ways to explain it simply, of if you don't play the game the way it's been done for this long, you are not going to be in as good of a position as you would on your own.
Yeah.
Plain and simple.
Yeah.
And so a verdict was decided by a jury and awarded in the billions dollar amount, and some suggested rule changes in which the National Association of Realtors took very seriously and decided to do some self-imposed rules prior to the final settlement of this lawsuit, which hasn't quite happened. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes settlements happening right now, proposed settlements with the major franchises, medium-sized franchises, and the National Association of Realtors, a lot of which are not complete yet.
Yeah, but self-imposing to start to say, hopefully this will then play well as we continue to find out what the actual rulings are going to be. But I think it's important to understand that from a regulation perspective, there's not a whole lot of governing bodies associated with regulating this. This is self-imposed. This is now the changes that NAR has said. If you are a realtor, this is what you need to do now.
Yeah, if you're a kid and you steal a dozen cookies from mom's cookie jar and she gets upset with you about it, and you say, I'm going to go clean the whole kitchen and I'm going to clean the whole house. And hopefully that kind of buys me some forgiveness here. This is what we're seeing with NAR in a kind of a metaphor of, they're saying like, okay, you're saying we were doing something wrong, so we are now going to make some changes we feel will put us in some good light before the gavel drops.
Yeah, absolutely. So now that we understand that, and if you've been following this at all, you're probably starting to get a pretty good handle on what does this actually mean now for practicing real estate. We've got, I think, four points to hit on here, Jeff. So now we've got, this is how we got here. This is the new way we're going to start practicing. And let's talk through four major points here that are changes that we're going to start seeing or have started seeing in the last few days.
There's really 3 or 4 main components to these rule changes. Some states put these rules into place earlier than August 17th, but August 17th was the national deadline for these rules to be enforced and put out into the field. So that was Saturday, right? So this is less than a week ago when the entire country went under these new rules. And of these 3 or 4 changes to how everyone has been conducting business for decades, the biggest one is that no more commissions are going to be advertised in the MLS. Now, somebody might say, why is that a huge deal? Can't they just talk to each other and tell each other can't a realtor who's listing a house just verbally or on a different website than the MLS say, the seller or us as the brokerage, we're charging X and we're going to offer to pay a buyer broker 5% to represent their buyer in a successful transaction. Can you do that? Yes, you can still do that. You can have those conversations. You can put it on a different website anywhere but the MLS. But the problem or the trick or the thing that makes this complicated is the only contractual item on the multiple listing service was the commission. So if it's stated on the multiple listing page that the realtors had access to, that the buyer broker was to receive 5% of the sales price upon a successful closing, that was contractual between the brokers, between the listing broker and the buying broker. Okay, the list price of the house isn't contractual. What is in the house is not contractual. It doesn't say, hey, this house is for sale for $800,000. So contractually, the buyer must bring us $800,000. That was not a contractual thing. The commission, however, was. So that's a huge change to where if I'm a buyer broker now, and I am taking a buyer to go look at a property, the buyer and myself representing them will not know if the seller or the broker representing the seller is offering any sort of compensation.
Yeah, so let's talk about what that then looks if you are representing the buyer. So the majority of the changes here are for the buyer's agent. So let's talk about number 2 here, buyer contracts required for showings.
So this is going to be new for every state. It's going to be really new for a lot of states. So I'm going to explain a little bit on that. Where we live in the state of Minnesota, buyer representation contracts is the law. We have had since 1986 buyer representation, I believe it was 86, don't quote me on that, but I think it was around then. We have had buyer representation in which you needed to have a legal contract to represent a buyer in a real estate transaction. Only 17 states of the 50 in the United States required that until August 17th. Okay. So if you live somewhere outside of Minnesota or one of those 17 states, this is brand new practice for the buyer's agents. Now, they may have had a brokerage that required it. They may have had it part of their own personal practice. I'm sure they had access to buyer representation contracts, but it was not a law that you had to have one to represent and get paid to help that buyer procure and then ultimately close on a property. Still, even if this was your standard of practice and this is something you're used to, they have now added another layer of contractual obligation to before you can even show a property to a buyer, which that was never a standard of practice suggested to have a buyer representation contract before you would go start working on behalf of a buyer. You'd enter into that relationship. You now have to have a legal contract in place to even show a property to somebody. So Paul, if you called me tomorrow and we're good friends and you said, hey, this new house came up for sale down the street. We've had our eye on it for 15 years. And we've always said, if it came up for sale, we'd love to buy it. Can you show it to us this weekend? I would say, absolutely. 2 weeks ago, we'd just go meet at the house.
Which we've done.
We have done that. And if you decided to buy it, I would have you enter into a buyer contract and we would try to purchase the house. As of August 17th, I would need to say, Paul, I would love to show you this house. I need you to sign this contract. It's a touring agreement in which we both need to sign saying, I'm able to show the house to you. And that's going to be the case in all circumstances other than a buyer walking into an open house. If I'm the listing agent or a member of the brokerage representing the listing agent and a buyer walks into the property, I don't have to have them sign something to take a walk around the house in an open house. However, in dual agency, where the buyer and the seller are both represented by either the same person or the same company, you still have to have that touring agreement in place. And that's going to be a change to the practice. And I've already seen countless circumstances where agents know that this change happened last week, and they just forget about it because it is so uncommon to not be able to just go see a property with someone who wants to see it as a licensed real estate agent. And now you have to have them enter into a new contract for that.
Yeah. And as part of that, we know that as part of the new contract that you're signing with your buyer's agent, now we have to start to talk about what is the commission structure and or what are you paying me, buyer, to go through that. So let's talk about number 3 here, about the commissions that are listed on the buyer contract. And I think this is one of the biggest ones that we start to get into. What is this going to look like now for title and for real estate attorneys as they're dealing with this?
So as a listing agent, you still have the option to, and I'm going to make up numbers here, right? Because part of this lawsuit was that there was an argument that commissions were standardized. There was collusion behind the scenes by real estate companies to keep commissions at a certain level, whether it was on the list side or the buy side. I don't believe that. I've never experienced it personally in my 18 years of doing this, but that was an argument that was made. If you, a listing agent who's going to represent a house that is for sale, meaning their name is on the sign that's outside, they can still have the option to charge 10% to the seller, and then offer a part of that 10% to the buyer's agent. You can still do that. It just won't be advertised in the multiple listing service. Now, the tricky part about this is commission sharing was something that was brought up in these cases. So in that scenario, if I say, I'm going to charge 10%, and then, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer Broker, I'm going to share a part of my 10% with you, that sounds a lot like commission sharing. And so I think we're going to see a move away from that to the listing broker or listing agent signing a listing contract with their seller just for their services. And now in every state, to my knowledge, and it's a brand new line in our purchase agreement, our boilerplate Minnesota state forms, and this is the case in pretty much every state. If it wasn't in there already, there's now a line for the seller to pay the buyer broker directly. So when a buyer now is represented by a buyer's agent, they will sign a buyer representation contract. So I'm your agent, sign this. We're now like married. We're not dating with the touring contract anymore. We're married. I have a full representation agreement with you, and I'm going to charge you 4% to represent. If the seller happens to pay a commission, that usually will offset that 4% to an extent. Okay. So now we go look at a property. I have an option as the buyer's agent. You have the option as the buyer now in the purchase agreement, which for many states was not in there before, to ask the seller directly to pay the buyer's agent. So historically, it was the broker taking part of their commission, paying the buyer's agent. Now, what I think is going to be most common, and I'm actually for it, is for the seller to pay their listing agent, and then the seller, if it's in the purchase agreement, to pay the buyer's agent. Now, really tricky part with this is a big rule. Another rule, we can call it rule number 3, because that's what's on the screen, is the buyer's agent, whatever they sign. So I signed that 4% contract with you. If the seller says, we'd really love this house to be sold, we're willing to give you 5% to bring a buyer and sell this house for us as the listing party, it is no longer within the parameters of the rules to collect more commission than what our contract says. So if I'm charging you 4 and they're paying 5, I can only collect 4%. Could you amend the buyer's agent contract to go up? You're not supposed to, but I see that a lot of unique things potentially happening in that situation.
Yeah. So as the person who's like bringing all this together at the end of the transaction, this is a new thing. And this is one of the main points we're going to get to when we talk about that. I think the 4th point is now coming into a pretty clear picture. Commission structures are just going to change.
So everything we've talked about so far, everyone, is how is this affecting the real estate agent, the listing agent, the buying agent, and then the buyer and the seller? These last 2 points, where the buyer's agent is not able to collect more than what is in their buyer representation contract, and then how commissions are potentially changing. This is going to have direct implications for you, the title industry, because there is a real scenario here, and I know it's happening in some areas, in which case some of the responsibility on keeping track of this is going to fall on you.
Which is like almost anything, I think, in the transaction where we're starting to talk about bringing cash in and pushing cash out. This often falls on your plate. So this is the big thing. We're going to get into it. We're about 20 minutes into this thing. We're going to keep rolling. Let's keep rolling on this thing. Okay. So in general, though, Let's just zoom back out one more time. You told me this really probably not that surprising for most folks on this webinar, like stat that maybe 25% of realtors still aren't really sure exactly what all of this is.
Yeah, I'm sure it's not surprising to you guys. Look, I know how you feel about this, okay? I know how you feel about real estate agents, and there's a reason for that. And that's a quarter of all real estate agents who this is their profession haven't heard about this whole thing, which is mind-blowing to me, but I've had firsthand accounts and firsthand experience in the last couple of weeks where I know that's the case.
Yeah. And Jeff, we've talked about this a lot. Things that could come from this: buyers' commissions likely going down, sellers' commissions maybe going up. And one of the biggest impacts this could have, and this could be because of the market and things that way, but you were telling me that in Minnesota, we're down about 10% total realtors practicing today.
Yeah.
So this is going to cause consolidation. I should say it's likely to cause consolidation and a lot of the other stuff that we talked about. And we're not even sure this is the end of it. This is phase one, like we talked about, self-imposed. It's going to be really interesting to understand, what does the Department of Justice decide?
Yep.
Is this enough? Are there more changes coming at the local association level to NAR in and of itself?
There's massive changes, and we're far from it. You mentioned very early in this program that tech has had a lot to say in the world of real estate. And one could argue that nothing really has come in that seemed like it was going to be a threat that has done a whole lot. This has the potential, probably the most potential of anything I've seen. You talk about the multiple listing service. Well, how do people have access to the multiple listing service? The multiple listing service was started by the Realtor Association and local associations. And I can tell you right now, a vote is happening today at the St. Paul Association of Realtors, in which their members are voting to say, you don't need to be a realtor to have access to the MLS anymore. And that's going to be a massive change, because if you don't need to have the realtor tag to have access to the MLS, what's the incentive to have the realtor tag? Does the word realtor matter as much as it used to? Do people use that term? Or is it, I'm a real estate agent, I can do everything I did before, I just can't call myself a realtor? Time's going to tell, and that's going to have major implications.
Yeah, big time. Pretty crazy for the second largest association in the country. Pretty wild. Okay, we finally are here. We're ready to talk about what are the impacts. We got 3 main points that we're going to talk about as we get into title, and you're probably picking up some of what we've been talking about so far. Number one, it's really important to understand what's in that buyer's representation contract.
Yes.
So just hit on this one more time. Let's just talk specifically about what we need to be thinking about.
If you guys are preparing Alta settlement statements and you put on the seller's side that they're paying a 3% commission to the buyer's real estate brokerage, and the buyer's representation contract says that they're charging 2%, there's a 1% difference in there that can't be charged, and someone's going to have to write that check out after closing back to the party in which was wronged in that situation. So it's going to be really imperative for all of you in the title industry to make sure that you have all the information you need ahead of time to really nail that commission. Wasn't really a big deal before. A check could be written after closing if it was shorted or if it was over or whatever. Now this is a legal contract situation, and a commission being paid out that's too much or too little or by the wrong party. Who's the commission coming from? Is it coming from the brokerage? That would be on the seller side of the Alta. Is the seller paying out 1%? But the buyer's representation contract says 2%. Now we've got a 1% commission on the buyer's side of the Alta, and that's unusual too. Really focusing in on those commissions on how they're structured in the Alta is going to be really important. It's not a change. You've always done it. It's not going to be as common as it always was before.
Yeah, and I think you said you've seen this already with across the country, people starting to go like, oh, this is starting to fall on the title company. So again, not fully regulated, but as we know in our space, this is just something to start to get out in front of. And I think at CloseSimple, we help our customers capture this type of commissions information and things like that through our products. So whether you're using a closing worksheet that you do today, or you're using technology to capture this, it's going to be really important to be out.
Yeah, I don't know what the penalty is going to be if a commission was paid out too much than what is on the buyer representation contract. But if it's falling under the title companies and they are going to be the regulators of this, and something happens to get paid out that's too much compared to what's on the contract, whose job was that to police it? Like who potentially gets a slap on the wrist for that? time will tell.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So second, yeah. So we just hit on this. So like the job of paying the buyer agent commissions and making sure that the money goes to the right place is, we can't say it's likely to fall in title and escrow, but it feels like that's probably where.
Just like we said at the beginning, we're not lawyers. This is not legal advice. Just like we'll say now, we can't say what's likely and what's not likely. These are predictions, but some of them are pretty easy to come to a conclusion that it might be the case.
Yeah. Number three, and this is something that Jeff and I have been talking about a lot, because commissions are going to change. We're going to be talking more and more about consolidation, I believe, in the industry. Really important as owners, marketing, etc., to be really reaching out to your best listing agents.
Yeah, in the title industry, we all know that the purchasing sides are more valuable because of the title insurance premiums that the title companies get to put into place. The listing side, typically not as profitable, but still a very important job. At this point, I think it's very likely that we're going to see a lot of buyers decide, hey, before I enter into a buyer representation contract and agree to pay this real estate agent 3% of my money to help me procure a home,
or even one,
or what this is big dollars we're talking about. I'm going to go look at homes independently. If the home I happen to fall in love with is not paying a buyer representation agreement, I may just end up working with the listing agent. So that listing agent is going to be a gateway into both the buyer side and the listing side. Dual agency is way less common than two different brokerages representing the parties. I think we're going to see that happen a lot more, and it's going to be driven by buyers potentially not wanting to enter into buyer contracts until they know if the seller or the broker on the other side is going to pay their buyer agent on their behalf.
Yeah. Who are your best listing agents? Get together with them.
Yep.
Right
Just
now.
see how they're feeling.
Yeah.
Check on your friends.
Check on your friends.
Check on your friends.
I like it. And then, like we said, the stat is that 25% of realtors are still unaware of exactly what's happening.
Mhm.
We need to help the realtors get up to speed on this stuff, because again, as title companies, the more opportunities we have to get in front of folks, the more business, obviously, that we're bringing in. So if you can take anything that you've learned today, anything that Alt is putting out there in terms of content, and really start to understand what this is, host trainings, get people up to speed, that sort of thing, it's going to be a really great opportunity to interact with your customers, as well as help all of us elevate the industry a little.
Look, this is a win. If you, as the title professional, can be the expert here, or know all of the stuff that's happening, this is going to be a win for you guys, because a good real estate agent, their number one priority is taking care of their people in a big way, and the commissions are a nice side effect. But the number two reason they probably do this job is for their income. And
Probably.
so they care a lot when the check at the closing table is the accurate check.
I'm going to just stop and say it for everybody on this call. It's maybe the only thing y'all care about, Jeff.
Hey, it's a big deal. I got kids. I got to feed my kids. But if you can put them into a situation where you are educating them on how can you, as the real estate agent, best talk to me as the title person to make sure I have your commissions accurate before closing day comes, that's going to benefit everybody here, both buyer and seller. The altas are going to be correct. And guess what? You're going to get paid the right amount on closing day. And I want to make sure that we're being proactive. Your real estate agents will really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're a little over time. We want to make sure we get like the right amount of content in from us to you. And hopefully this has been really helpful as we've walked through this. At CloseSimple, I'm going to wrap up our webinar here, Jeff, and thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
We're going to stay on, like I said, we're going to do some Q&A, and maybe we'll make some of this available after too, but we're going to wrap our webinar. We talked a little bit about CloseSimple at the beginning of this conversation. We really try to partner with title and escrow companies, with real estate attorneys to help elevate the closing experience. One of the ways we do that is we help capture buyer, seller, and realtor forms information at the beginning of the transaction. A lot of our customers use our portal and our communication strategies to get what is the commission looking at. As you can see, this is going to be bigger and bigger in the ways that we do that. If you have any questions about CloseSimple, you can reach directly out to me, Paul at CloseSimple.com, and we can certainly find some time for myself or someone from my team to walk you through exactly what we do, how we partner with folks in the industry. But thanks so much for checking out this webinar. Thanks again, Jeff, for coming out.
Appreciate
Hopefully you got something to take away, work with your customers on, help your team understand exactly what's going on here. So thanks again for joining. But yeah, That was fun.
Good stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. All right. See ya.